The autumn assembly at Halswick was the season's last vanity before the county retreated indoors for winter, and the room had decided within the first quarter hour of Cecily Vane's arrival that she did not belong there. She had come at the invitation of Mrs. Quandon. Pritchard, who had known her father and felt, in the imprecise way of kind-hearted women, that a young woman employed behind a draper's counter needed the occasional reminder that she had once occupied a different sort of life. It was a kindness Cecily accepted without illusion. The gown she wore was plain white cambric, retrimmed along the bodice where the lace had frayed, and it sat in sharp relief against the saturated silks and Antwerp lace that surrounded her on every side. She carried no fan. She carried no companion worth mentioning. She stood near the windows that overlooked the courtyard and watched the room conduct its familiar business, which was the business of measuring worth and finding it in most cases already allocated. The candelabra above the floor sent light across the assembled silk and the assembled shoulders and the assembled expressions of people who had already been decided, and the music, from the small orchestra at the far end, played on with its own sort of. She had been standing there approximately 12 minutes when Lady Dorothea Creswick swept across the floor in ice-blue grosgrain, her companion at her elbow, and paused within very deliberate earshot of 3 other women and a small cluster of gentlemen. Lady Dorothea was not a cruel woman in the way that novelists mean cruelty. She was a precise woman. She aimed her remarks the way a sportsman aims a shot, at the cleanest angle, with the least unnecessary effort. "That girl near the windows," she said, her voice pitched at a register that carried beautifully across a polished floor. "The steward's daughter, and nothing more. I cannot imagine what she is doing here." The 3 women near her did not look towards Cecily directly. They did not need to. The assessment had been delivered and received, and the room processed it the way rooms process information they have been prepared to accept. A slight adjustment of attention. A small recalibration of space. The cluster of gentlemen found somewhere else to stand. If you have ever stood in a room that has just decided what you are, you will understand what Cecily felt in those seconds. Stay a little longer. What she did with it matters. Cecily did not move from the window. Her hands did not grip each other too tightly, though the effort of ensuring this was not small. She had heard the phrase before. It had been used to her face and to her back and through the medium of third parties who reported it, without quite meaning to wound her. And it had worn a groove in her that she no longer dignified with flinching. What she did not see standing at that window was the man who had come to stand against the far wall sometime in the past few minutes. He was not, by any visible measure, watching her. He held a glass of claret and appeared to be engaged in the careful examination of a painting above the mantelpiece, a dull pastoral in oils that had hung there for 30 years and offered no particular reason for sustained attention. His jaw was set with a slight tension that was not anger precisely, but something close to its cooler cousin. He had hair as dark as a winter sky before snow, and a face that would have been called handsome by anyone who could persuade it to soften, which it showed, at present, no inclination to do. He watched Cecily Vane decline to flinch. He did not look away for a long time. She had not been born to the draper's shop. Her father, Aldous Vane, had served the Marquess of Creswick for 22 years as steward of Thornfield Park, which was the Marquess's principal estate, and a house that had grown across those 2 decades, considerably larger and more furnished than the fortune recorded in the public record could convincingly explain. Her father had been, by every account of people who had known him, a meticulous and honest man. He kept his accounts in a particular hand, neat columns, no erasures, every figure traced twice. He had allowed Cecily, from the age of 16, to assist him during the autumn settlement weeks when the ledgers for the harvest quarter were produced and reconciled. And she had learned to read accounts the way a musician learns to read a score, not merely as information but as character. Numbers told you what a household believed about itself. What the Thornfield accounts told her, in the year she was permitted to see them, was that they were telling 2 different stories. She had mentioned this to her father once carefully, seated beside him at the long table in the estate office while rain moved across the window glass. He had looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he had said, "Finish the column, Cecily." And she had understood that the subject was closed. Her father died in January of the preceding year. He had been ill for some months, and had asked her in the last week of his life to bring him the small iron key that hung on a hook behind the estate office door, the key whose purpose she had never been told. He pressed it into her hand. "Keep this," he said. "Keep it safe, Cecily." He died 3 days later. Within a fortnight, the Marquess of Creswick's solicitor, a Mr. Peck, arrived at the cottage with a set of documents that made a claim she had not expected. Her father, it was alleged, had systematically falsified the estate accounts over a period of several years, diverting modest sums that accumulated to a figure of £300 and more. The estate had absorbed the loss and chosen, out of long association, to address the matter quietly, rather than through the magistrate. Cecily was not, therefore, to be prosecuted. She was, however, dismissed from her position at Thornfield, and the cottage she had lived in since childhood was, the solicitor noted, technically estate property and subject to review. She had taken the position at the draper's shop in Halswick the following week. She kept the iron key on a thin ribbon beneath her collar. It was not that she believed her father had made provision for its use. She did not know what he had made provision for. She kept it because he had asked her to, and because she had nothing else left of him worth keeping except his name, which was not worth very much at present. It was a Thursday morning in the second week of October, when the bell above the draper's shop door announced a customer who did not move like a man who needed ribbon. He was tall and wore a dark coat, and carried himself with the controlled economy of someone who had learned long ago that posture was a form of argument. He examined the bolts of cloth arranged along the counter with the expression of a man genuinely attempting to convince himself he had come for cloth. He had not, Cecily thought, come for cloth. She waited. "Miss Vane," he said. She looked up from the ledger she had been entering. "You have the advantage of me, sir," she said. "I am Ashmore," he said. "Viscount Ashmore. I have been making inquiries in the county." He paused. "About Thornfield Park." Cecily set her pen down with a care she did not entirely feel. "Then, I am afraid you have come to the wrong shop," she said. "I am no longer connected to Thornfield Park." "I know what you are connected to," he said. His voice was level in a way that was not indifference. It was something more precisely controlled than indifference. "I also know what your father was connected to." Before she could answer, the bell above the door rang again. Mr. Peck was a compact man, in a brown coat with the careful obsequiousness of someone who had practiced it until it fit. He placed a document on the counter with a small, regretful smile. "Miss Vane," he said, "I am glad to find you at home, as it were. I have a simple matter for your signature. A statement only, confirming that you were present on certain occasions in the estate office when certain transactions were conducted. It is a formality. £10 is offered for your trouble." He laid the document open. She read it without touching it. She read it once, and then she read it again. Then she folded it at its center crease and placed it back on the counter. "No," she said. "Miss Vane, the sum is generous," he began. "No," she said again. Her voice did not change. She moved the document 2 inches to her right, so that it was fully clear of her ledger, as if it were something that had accidentally contaminated her workspace and required only repositioning. "Mr. Quar." Peck gathered it with a careful look. She had learned to read as a kind of stored menace, and left. The shop was quiet for a moment. Then the Viscount Ashmore, who had not moved from his position near the bolts of cloth, set his hat on the counter. "Do not sign anything that man brings you," he said. "I had already declined," she said. "I am aware." Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a stone wall shifts in early frost. A tightening, a slight compression, as if whatever had been pressing against it had applied a degree more force than it expected. "I am aware," he said again, more quietly. "I have been watching Peck for 3 months." She looked at him. He was standing very still, the way she had noticed he stood when he was actually attending to something, which was not the same stillness as indifference. His eyes were gray, and they were on her with a quality of attention she was not accustomed to receiving from men of his position, which was the quality of a person actually looking rather than registering a category and proceeding. She was aware, in the way one becomes aware of the temperature of a room when it changes, that the shop had grown quieter around them. "You were in this shop when he came," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not add anything to this. "You did not announce yourself." "No." A pause. "I was uncertain at that point, whether you would want me to." It was a careful thing to say. It was the thing a man said when he had been watching long enough to understand that the person he was watching had reason not to trust offers of assistance from strangers, and who chose, therefore, to wait until the stranger's purpose was legible before making it known. She said, "And now?" "Now," he said, "I am announcing myself." They stood across the counter from each other in the particular silence of two people who have recognized, without yet being willing to say so, that they are in possession of pieces of the same map. Lady Dorothea Creswick came to the draper's shop the following week to purchase trimming for a morning gown, and she brought with her a companion named Miss Foss, who was young and easily impressed, and to whom Lady Dorothea directed most of her observations in a voice that was not quite quiet enough. "I cannot think why the proprietress keeps the girl on," she said, moving a bolt of rose-colored satin with 2 fingers. "One hears things. Of course, the father was very thoroughly disgraced. The steward's daughter and nothing more. Whatever airs the seasons used to allow her." Cecily measured 12 inches of figured muslin at the far end of the counter and folded it neatly and said nothing. The weight of the key against her collarbone was a small, particular pressure. It had become, across 18 months, a kind of anchor. Not comfort exactly, but solidity. The Marquess had, in the fortnight since Mr. Fortiga Peck's visit to the shop, renewed his legal pressure on the cottage. A document had arrived from the estate office, claiming the lease of the cottage had technically reverted to the estate upon her father's death, and that her continued residence, she had not resided there in months, had constituted an unauthorized occupation. The figure of the outstanding debt had been revised upward to £340. She had 10 days, the letter said, to produce the sum, or vacate. She had carried this letter to the Viscount Ashmore at the King's Head Coaching Inn, where he was staying, because there was no one else to carry it to, and because some quieter part of her had recognized in him a man who would read it and respond to it usefully rather than sympathetically, which was what she needed. He read it twice, in the way she had already noticed he did with documents, and then he looked up. "Tell me about the house," he said. "The domestic geography, the rooms below stairs," she told him. She told him about the long corridor from the kitchen passage to the still room, and the still room's neighboring door, and behind that door the small room that had served, when the estate was first built, as a secondary pantry for the household's preserved stores. Her father had used it in his last years as a private place for documents he considered sensitive. He had said once, in a passing remark she had not understood at the time, that it was the one room in the house where the Marquess would never think to look, because the Marquess had, in his whole adult life, never once gone below stairs. "The key," she said, and her hand went to the ribbon at her throat without quite knowing it had moved. "Yes," he said. He was watching her hand, not her face. Then his gaze lifted to her face and she looked away. He told her that evening what had been taken from his mother. The King's Head had a small private parlor at the back that smelled of tallow and old wood, and the particular staleness of a room that was rarely used. He had arranged for tea, which sat between them untouched in the way that tea arranged by men who have not thought about whether it will actually be consumed tends to sit. The fire was low. Outside a thin October rain had resumed. It was not a long account. He did not embellish it. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and placed on the table between them a small oval miniature in a worn silver frame, the portrait of a woman with fair hair and a gentle, slightly apologetic expression. And he said, she was the daughter of a man who left her a modest trust, £12,000. The Marquess was appointed executor. When she wrote to ask about the quarterly interest, she received a letter from Peck, explaining that the funds had been unfortunately absorbed in a series of unsuccessful investments made, in her name, on her behalf. He was quiet for a moment. She believed him. She apologized to me for the loss in her last letter. She thought it was her own carelessness that had left the trust underprotected. It was not her carelessness. He had said it all in the same level register, and Cecily recognized the register, because she had used it herself. It was the register you developed when you had said a thing so many times inside your own mind that the saying of it aloud had been drained of its capacity to undo you. And what remained was just the words, factual and very clean, like a wound that had healed badly and was therefore no longer sensitive to the touch. She looked at the miniature. The woman in it had the kind of face that expected the world to be more honest than it was, and had spent a long time adjusting to the disappointment. She died believing it, she said. Yes, he said. The small word held a great deal. She understood that he had been carrying it for a long time, the particular weight of a grief that had anger folded inside it, and that the anger had nowhere productive to go until now. The fire shifted and threw a brief, warm light across the table between them, across the miniature and the untouched tea, and his hands, which were still in the way of a man who has learned that stillness is more reliable than motion, when what he is feeling cannot be usefully expressed. The ledgers will show the trust, she said. If my father kept the true accounts, they will show the trust. He was meticulous. He kept everything. Then we need to go into Thornfield, he said. I know how to go into Thornfield, she said. The plan was simple and the execution of it was not. Cecily wrote to Mrs. Sell. Hooper, who had been the Thornfield housekeeper for 30 years, and who had been fond of her father in the way of a colleague who has shared a workplace long enough to have weathered several weathers together, she wrote that she had left a small box of her father's personal correspondence in the estate office's lower drawer, in the confusion of the dismissal, and asked if she might come to retrieve it on the following Tuesday, when the Marquess and Marchioness would be away at a neighboring estate for the afternoon shooting party. Mrs. Hooper wrote back to say she was welcome, and that Tuesday at 2 o'clock would suit very well. Cecily arrived at 2 o'clock. She retrieved the box, which was real, and which did contain her father's letters, and she thanked Mrs. Taine, Hooper, and spent 20 minutes taking tea in the housekeeper's sitting room and listening to the news of the household, which Mrs. Hooper offered freely in the manner of someone who had not been given much company lately. At 2:30 she excused herself to use the back passage, which was true. And in the back passage she turned left instead of right. The door to the secondary pantry was where she remembered it. Small, set flush with the wall. Easy to miss if you did not know to look. She fitted the iron key into the lock. It turned. She was inside for perhaps 3 minutes. Long enough to see what was there. She was coming back through the passage when the Marquess's carriage came early up the drive, the shooting party having been cut short by rain, and Lord Aldrich Branwell, Marquess of Creswick, entered through the main hall with his boots wet and his temper sharp, and turned in the direction of the kitchen passage for reasons she could not explain, and found her in the corridor. He was a large man. He had always been a large man. She had been aware of this since childhood in the imprecise way that one is aware of the dimensions of a house one has grown up in, and she felt it now with a precision she had not expected, the specific quality of the space between them in the narrow passage, narrowing further as he did not quite block her way, but, regardless, blocked. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord." She said, "I did not expect to find you in my house." "I came to retrieve my father's correspondence," she said. "Mrs. Hooper gave me leave." "Indeed," he said. The word was very smooth. He had a voice that had always reminded her of the surface of water that is concealing the depth below it. "And have you retrieved it?" She held up the box. It was a plain wooden box of the kind her father had used for personal letters. It was completely real. Everything she had said was completely true. The iron key hung beneath her collar and she did not touch it. "Yes," she said. He looked at the box and then at her face. She waited with a stillness she had spent the previous hour constructing and did not let it crack. "Then I trust," he said, still in that smooth voice, "that you have found what you came for." "Yes," she said again. "Good afternoon, my lord." She left. Her hands were steady on the box she carried. She did not look back. She did not breathe properly until the lane's first turning had put the house's gate behind her. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the draper's shop from the Viscount Ashmore. His father, the Earl of Dunmore, had suffered an episode of illness and he had been summoned north. He was very sorry. He would return as soon as he could. She sat with the letter for a long time. That same afternoon, a kitchen maid from Thornfield named Betsy, who had served tea in the housekeeper's sitting room on the day of Cecily's visit, came to the shop on a thin pretext of purchasing pins. She was a kind girl, Betsy, and she had the look of someone carrying news she was not sure how to deliver. "My lady the Marchioness," she said, lowering her voice over the pin tray, "was speaking to his lordship last evening, very late. When she thought the house was asleep, she said, 'You could do nothing.' She said you were only the steward's daughter, and nothing more, and that if you had found anything in the house you would not know what to do with it." Betsy pressed her lips together. "I thought you ought to know," she said it. "Thank you, Betsy," said Cecily. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it in the shop and above the shop and in the cold morning light before the town woke, standing at the window with the key in her palm. She had found what was there. She knew what she had seen. The ledgers were there, both of them, her father's and the Marquess's forged version, stacked in a tin box on the 3rd shelf, the tin locked with a small padlock that her iron key opened just as easily as it had opened the pantry door itself. She had not taken them. She had not been certain enough of what came next to take them. She had said to herself, waiting for Ashmore. The question she sat with in those 3 days was not whether the ledgers existed. She had seen them. They existed. The question was whether seeing them was sufficient, and what sufficient meant, and who in this county had the standing to make the ledger's testimony legible before an audience that would otherwise dismiss her. She thought about the Marchioness's words carried to her through Betsy's careful, lowered voice. The phrase had been rendered to her verbatim, and she had sat with it as one sits with something that has landed harder than expected. The particular cruelty of it was not its content. The content was merely an opinion, and opinions could be corrected. Its cruelty was its certainty. Lady Dorothea had said it without the smallest inflection of doubt, the way one states a fact about the weather or the state of a road. The phrase assumed that the category it named was permanent, that what a woman's father had been was what she would always be, that the ledgers in the tin box on the 3rd shelf of a locked room were irrelevant, because the person who had found them and the person who had kept them were both, in the Marchioness's reckoning, nothing more. She was tired of being nothing more. She was tired of waiting for someone else. She was composing in her mind a letter to Sir Nathaniel Croft, who was the county magistrate, and who had known her father by reputation, when the bell above the shop door rang at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, and the Viscount Ashmore came in out of a gray October rain, water on his coat, and said, "Is the key still around your neck?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "We are going to Thornfield tonight. The magistrate is already in the county. I have also brought someone you will want to meet." The man he had brought was a Mr. Brad Dowell from the Treasury Board's examining office in London, who was spare and precise and had the look of a man who had been waiting for this particular thread to become pullable for some time. He shook Cecily's hand in the direct way of a man who has temporarily decided not to notice that he is shaking the hand of a young woman behind a draper's counter. "I have been building a case against Branwell for 2 years, he said. "I am missing the original estate accounts. A witness who can attest to their location and to the chain of custody from the steward's hand to the present would be of considerable value." "I can attest to all of it," she said. The Marquess of Creswick held his annual October dinner every 3rd Wednesday of the month. A fixed tradition of 22 years, and 20 guests had arrived at Thornfield Park that evening, to find their host in his customary chair at the head of a table that ran 30 feet and was lit by candelabra that had been purchased. as Cecily's father had noted in the true ledger from a silversmith whose bill had never been recorded in any account the Marquess had shown to his solicitors. They arrived at the kitchen entrance at 9:30. Cicely led, then Ashmore, then the magistrate, Sir Nathaniel Croft, a large man with a quiet manner that had the effect of making rooms feel suddenly smaller, and Mr. Dowell of the Treasury Board with a leather satchel that clinked softly with its brass fittings. Mrs. Hooper let them in without being asked. She had seen the carriages from the upper window and had the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the correct people to arrive. She took Cecily's hand for a moment at the door. She did not say anything. She had been in this house for 30 years, and she knew the weight of the walls around her and what they had covered. And her hand said what her 30 years of service would not allow her voice to say, which was that she had known about the steward's accounts and had not known what to do about what she knew, and that she was glad, now, that someone else had known what to do. Cecily pressed her hand in return and went in. The sound from the dining room reached them through the stone and plaster of the house. The particular muffled warmth of 20 people at table, the clink of crystal, the overlap of voices. The corridor below stairs smelled of candle tallow, and beeswax, and the particular faint underlayer of cold stone that never fully went away, regardless of how much coal was burned above. Cecily led them through the kitchen passage and the back corridor and to the small door, set flush with the wall. She took the iron key from the ribbon at her collar. It was cold in her palm, as it always was, as if it stored no heat at all. The lock opened. The tin box was where she had left it. Mr. Dowell went through the ledgers at the long table in the servants' hall with the focused efficiency of a man reading a language he speaks fluently. He was quiet for 8 minutes. Then he looked up. "The forgery begins in the 3rd quarter of 1811, he said. "The handwriting in the altered entries is distinguishable from the primary hand by 3 consistent characteristics. The true accounts show payments to an investment trust in the name of Charlotte Farley that stop in the 3rd quarter of 1811 and do not resume." He looked at Ashmore. "Charlotte Farley was your mother?" "Yes," said Ashmore. Cecily watched his face in the moment after the word. It did not change. She had come to understand that his face changed very little as a matter of discipline, and that the small things it did when it was not quite managing the discipline were more meaningful for their smallness. And what she saw now was a tightness at the jaw that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and was perhaps the expression of someone who has been trying to prove a thing for a long time and has now proved it and does not yet know what to do with the proved version of the thing. She looked at the miniature he had left on the table beside the ledgers. The woman in it looked back at them both. Sir Nathaniel Croft read the relevant pages with his hands behind his back. He read them carefully. Cecily could hear the music from above, distant and entirely unaware of what was happening in the servants' hall. Then he said, "Shall we go in?" And it was not a question. The dining room of Thornfield Park fell into a silence that had a specific texture. The texture of 20 people becoming aware, in sequence, that the world they had just been inhabiting was being altered. The Marquess of Creswick rose from his chair at the head of the table. He was a large man, and he had the assurance of someone who had performed the role of Lord Creswick for so long that the performance had become, as far as he was concerned, the same thing as the man. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, and his voice was very certain. The voice of a man who has never had cause to doubt that rooms rearrange themselves around his certainty. They did not this time. Sir Nathaniel Croft introduced himself and Mr. Dowell and explained in brief and plain sentences what had been found and where it had been found, and in whose custody it had been kept for 18 months. Lady Dorothea Creswick, at the far end of the table, had gone very still. Her fan was in her hands. She did not open it. The Marquess said anything in that room was placed there fraudulently. "The girl is her father's daughter, and her father was a thief. And I will," he said. "The primary ledger is in the hand of Aldous Vane," Mr. Dowell said, without raising his voice. "The secondary ledger, in which certain figures have been altered, is in a different hand. I am prepared to state, before any inquiry, that the alterations postdate the original entries by, at minimum, 3 years. The ink composition is distinguishable." The Marquess opened his mouth. Ashmore crossed the room in 4 measured strides and stood at Cecily's side. He did not look at the Marquess when he spoke. He looked at Sir Nathaniel Croft and at the assembled guests, and his voice was level and carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Her father's name is cleared," he said. "This house belongs to her." Lady Dorothea's fan dropped. It made a small, precise sound against the marble floor. She reached for it and did not find it, and did not reach again. The Marquess said, "You cannot," he began. "The entail on the cottage reverts to Vane's estate," Sir Nathaniel said. "The debt claimed against it was based on falsified records. It does not exist." Miss Isolde Haverstock, who had been seated 4 places from the Marquess, and had been very young and very uncomprehending up until this moment, stood up quietly from her chair and moved to stand near the doorway, which put a significant portion of the dining table between herself and the man who had been managing her interests. The Marquess of Creswick's voice, when it came again, was smaller than it had been. Not small. Smaller. The room had stopped rearranging itself around it. Lady Dorothea did not speak at all after the fan fell. The following morning, in the light of a pale October sun that came through the draper's shop windows at an angle that turned the bolts of cloth to something almost warm, Cecily stood behind the counter and opened the shop ledger and picked up her pen, and felt the weight of the key against her collarbone. It was lighter than she expected. She had been expecting it to feel lighter for a long time, and she had not allowed herself to expect it too much, in case it never came. And now that it had come, she was not sure what to do with the space the weight had occupied. The bell above the door rang. Ashmore came in with rain in his hair again, which seemed to be a condition of his arrivals in this town, and stood on the other side of the counter, and did not pretend to examine the cloth. "The magistrate will formally clear your father's record before the month is out," he said. "Dowell has what he needs for the Treasury inquiry. The cottage is yours." "I know," she said. Sir Nathaniel's clerk came at first light. "I know you know," he said. They stood across the counter in the particular quiet that had become, she realized, familiar. "You said," she began, and then stopped. "What did I say?" he said. His voice was the same level register, but something in the stillness of his face had changed in the way she had learned to read his face. A fraction of warmth admitted, the way a room admits light when a curtain is moved 2 inches rather than drawn. "You said this house belongs to her," she said, in front of 20 people and Sir Nathaniel Croft and the Treasury Board. "I did," he said. "The cottage is a cottage," she said. "Not a house." "No," he said. A pause. "I was speaking generally." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. "Show me the key," he said. "I have not seen it." She reached to the ribbon beneath her collar and drew it out. It rested in her palm, small and iron and ordinary. The key to a pantry in a house that had held a lie for 15 years and the truth inside the lie, both of them patient as stone in the dark. He took the key from her palm with his gloved hand. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way he looked at documents, twice, completely, with the full weight of his attention. Then he placed it back against her collarbone, his gloved fingers resting there for a beat, longer than the action required. She covered his hand with hers. The October light came through the window and lay across the bolts of cloth and across the open ledger and across their hands, one over the other in the quiet of the shop. Outside, Halswick was going about its morning. Inside, something that had been pressed under the weight of 18 months of patient endurance breathed out at last. By Christmas, her father's name had been formally restored to the public record. The cottage on the lane above the mill was hers, the deed transferred without encumbrance, and signed by Sir Nathaniel's clerk in the presence of 2 witnesses she had never expected to need. A notice in the county paper announced the Treasury inquiry into the estate of Lord Aldrich Branwell, Marquess of Creswick, and noted that proceedings were expected to be extensive. Mrs. Hooper accepted the position of housekeeper of the cottage, which had only 6 rooms and did not require a housekeeper, and which she came to anyway every Tuesday and Friday, because she had been fond of Vane and she was, she said, fond of his daughter. In the new year, Ashmore came down from the north. His father recovered, and he stood in the small sitting room of the cottage with the fire going and his coat damp from the lane and his hat in his hands, and said in the direct and unembellished way that Cecily had come to understand was simply how he spoke when he meant something, that his mother's trust, once recovered from the inquiry, would revert to the Farley estate, and that it was his intention, when the inquiry was concluded, to manage it himself rather than to appoint another executor. "Very sensible," said Cecily. "I should like," he said and paused, with the care of a man selecting a word precisely, "to manage it in partnership with someone whose understanding of accounts is more than competent." She looked at the fire. "That is the most indirect proposal I have ever received," she said. "It is the most indirect I have ever made," he said. "I am not practiced at this." "No," she said, and heard the almost amusement in her own voice which surprised her. "Neither am I." He crossed the room and stood before her, not taking her hand, but standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the December chill. And he said her name, her given name. He had not used it before. It sat differently in her ear than she had expected, heavier and more specific, like the sound of a key in a lock. "Cecily," he said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. The fire crackled. Snow had begun outside, soft and without ceremony, the first of the winter. In the small sitting room of the cottage that was hers, with the fire and the snow and the man who had stood at her side in the room where her father's name was restored, the key still hung on its ribbon. She did not take it off. She thought she would not take it off. It had kept her company for 18 months in the dark, and she was not yet ready to set it down, and she thought he understood this because he did not ask her to. She had worn it when she walked into that room. She would wear it a little longer. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's vigil moved you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know.